You consent by being here. 5 words, spoken without malice, without raised volume, without any of the theatrical cruelty that might warn someone they were about to be violated. Just a statement of fact, delivered by a man whose badge granted him the authority to rewrite reality whenever it suited him. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson County Municipal Courthouse hummed overhead, casting their institutional glow across water-stained ceiling tiles and linoleum floors scuffed by decades of shuffling feet. And in that moment, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a woman named Simone Adler understood with perfect clarity that she had found exactly what she came looking for. His hands were still on her body, too long, too invasive, fingers pressing against her waist, sliding down her thighs in movements that exceeded any reasonable interpretation of a security pat-down. Sergeant Brock Randall stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, 240 pounds of muscle and authority, wrapped in a courthouse security uniform, and he smiled while he touched her because he had done this hundreds of times before and nothing had ever happened to him. The court security log would later show the timestamp. 9:47 and 33 seconds. Morning. Incident flagged. Courtroom 4B. But that entry would come later, after everything changed, after the careful architecture of abuse that had operated in this courthouse for years came crashing down around the people who built it. For now, Simone stood motionless. Her weight had shifted to the balls of her feet without conscious thought, an adjustment so subtle that Randall never noticed. Her breathing remained steady. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The same rhythm she had learned in places far more dangerous than a Florida municipal building, in situations where panic meant death and stillness meant survival. She memorized his badge number without appearing to look at it, 4471, filed it away alongside the time, the location, the names she had already cataloged since arriving 3 hours earlier. In the gallery's front row, a woman in a gray blazer watched the interaction with careful attention. She reached for something inside her jacket. Not a phone. Something heavier. And somewhere in the building, a clock continued its indifferent count toward the moment when Brock Randall would finally meet the consequences he had spent 19 years avoiding. The story of how Simone Adler ended up in that courthouse began 3 hours earlier, when the morning sky was still pink with dawn and the building's parking lot held only a handful of early arrivals. She pulled into a space at 6:47, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic that fit her cover identity as a woman appearing for a routine traffic violation. The car's registration had expired 63 days ago. The citation in her folder showed a fine of $164. Simple, forgettable. Exactly the kind of minor infraction that brought thousands of ordinary citizens through these doors every month. She sat in the driver's seat for 2 full minutes before exiting, using the time to observe. The building itself was unremarkable, a concrete rectangle constructed sometime in the late 1970s and showing every year of deferred maintenance. Water stains traced abstract patterns down the exterior walls. 2 of the parking lot lights were burned out. The security cameras mounted at the corners of the building showed their age, and Simone noted which ones had functioning indicator lights and which did not. Her folder contained exactly 3 items. The traffic citation, a confirmation notice for her 8 o'clock hearing in traffic courtroom 4B, and a pen, because people who arrived at courthouses typically carried pens. Nothing else. No wallet beyond her driver's license. No phone case that might suggest expensive technology. No jewelry except a simple watch. She had dressed in dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse, professional enough to show respect for the court, but modest enough to avoid attracting attention. When she finally walked toward the building's entrance, she moved with the unhurried pace of someone who had arrived early and expected no complications. Her posture conveyed nothing unusual, just another citizen navigating the bureaucratic maze of the American judicial system. The metal detectors at the security checkpoint were models she recognized from the 1990s, the kind that airport security had replaced 20 years ago. 2 guards staffed the entrance, one manning the walk-through scanner, while the other supervised the conveyor belt for belongings. A 3rd guard, a woman with gray-streaked hair and a name tag reading M. Voss, sat at a desk slightly elevated above the checkpoint, observing everything with the proprietary gaze of someone who considered this space her personal domain. Simone placed her folder and phone in the plastic bin, walked through the detector without triggering any alarm, reached for her belongings. Marlene Voss raised one hand. The gesture was casual, almost lazy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Random secondary screening. The words hung in the air like smoke. Simone had watched 3 people pass through the checkpoint before her, all white. None had been stopped. She filed this observation away without comment. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice neutral. The secondary screening involved a handheld wand swept over her body and a more thorough examination of her folder's contents. Voss took her time, spreading the papers across the desk, studying the traffic citation as though it might contain coded messages. She held up the hearing confirmation notice, squinting at the typeface. "This for today?" "Yes, ma'am. 8 o'clock, courtroom 4B. Voss made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been dismissal. She reassembled the papers without any particular care for their original order and handed the folder back. "Waiting areas down that hall. On your left. Don't wander." The instruction was unnecessary for someone who had studied the building's floor plan for 3 weeks, but Simone thanked her anyway, collected her belongings, and walked in the direction indicated. The waiting area lived up to the building's general aesthetic of institutional neglect. Metal benches with minimal padding lined 3 walls. A water fountain occupied one corner, its basin stained with mineral deposits that suggested inconsistent cleaning. The restroom doors on the far side bore signs indicating that defendants required escort to use the facilities. A set of vending machines offered snacks and sodas at prices inflated well above retail, capturing revenue from people who had no other options during waits that could stretch for hours. 7 other defendants already occupied the benches. An elderly man in his Sunday best, hands folded in his lap, lips moving silently as he stared at the floor. A young mother holding an infant who slept despite the uncomfortable surroundings, her own eyes red with exhaustion. A teenager in a school uniform, probably brought here before classes by a parent who now sat beside him scrolling through a phone. 2 middle-aged men in work clothes, comparing paperwork and complaining quietly about lost wages. A woman approximately Simone's age, dressed similarly, who glanced up when Simone entered, and then returned her attention to a magazine that was 6 months out of date. Simone chose a seat at the end of one bench. Her back rested against the wall. From this position, she could see both the hallway entrance and the door to the courtroom area without turning her head. The positioning looked natural, just someone settling into an available spot, but it provided sightlines to every possible approach. She opened her folder, pretended to review her paperwork, and began counting. The cameras first. 2 visible in the waiting area. One near the ceiling in the northeast corner, indicator light glowing red. One above the courtroom doors, indicator light dark, possibly a dummy or simply broken. A 3rd camera covered the vending machine area, though its angle suggested it was positioned to catch theft rather than monitor defendant behavior. The personnel next. Through the window in the courtroom door, she could see bailiffs moving inside. She counted 3 over the next 15 minutes. The court clerk, a thin man with nervous hands, appeared twice, calling names from a list and escorting defendants through the door. His name tag read D. Meeks. The patterns took longer to establish. Traffic court apparently processed cases in no particular order of arrival. The elderly man, who had clearly been waiting before Simone arrived, still sat on his bench while the teenager was called first. Then the middle-aged men, together, their cases apparently related. Then the young mother, who gathered her sleeping infant and disappeared through the courtroom door with an expression of profound relief. 8:15 passed. Then 8:30. 8:45. Simone's case number remained uncalled. At 9 o'clock, she approached the clerk's window. Devin Meeks sat behind the glass, typing something on a computer whose monitor faced away from public view. He did not look up when she stopped in front of him. She waited 10 seconds. 15. 20. "Excuse me." He continued typing. "I'm checking on case number 2024 TC4471. Adler." Now he looked up, his expression conveying the particular annoyance of someone interrupted during important work, even though nothing about his previous posture had suggested urgency. "You'll be called when you're called." "I was scheduled for 8 o'clock. It's after 9. "Then you'll be called when you're called." The dismissal was complete and absolute. No explanation, no estimated wait time, just bureaucratic indifference deployed as a weapon. Simone thanked him anyway, returned to her seat, and continued her documentation. If this story already has you hooked, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment everything changes. By 10:15, the waiting area had cycled through 3 complete rotations of defendants. People who arrived after Simone had been processed and released. The elderly man remained, patience apparently infinite. The woman with the outdated magazine had left sometime around 9:30. New faces replaced the departed ones in an endless stream of citizens caught in the machinery of minor infractions. Simone approached the clerk's window a second time. "Case number 2024 TC 4471. Adler. I've been waiting over 3 hours." Meeks sighed, the sound theatrical and aggrieved, as though her presence constituted a personal imposition on his otherwise pleasant morning. "System shows your case is still pending call." "Is there a reason for the delay?" "That's not information I can share." "Can you tell me approximately when I might be called?" "When the judge is ready for your case." The circular logic was intentional. No information given, no timeline established. Just an expectation that she would return to her bench and wait indefinitely, losing wages, missing obligations, her time treated as worthless because the system had already decided she was guilty of something, even if only a registration violation. She returned to her seat. The elderly man caught her eye and shook his head slowly, a gesture of commiseration from someone who had clearly experienced this particular form of bureaucratic cruelty before. At 10:22, Simone rose from her bench and approached Marlene Voss's station near the security checkpoint. The chief bailiff looked up from whatever paperwork occupied her attention, her expression settling into something between suspicion and anticipation. "I need to use the restroom." "Restrooms are closed for cleaning." Simone glanced at the signs on the restroom doors. Neither displayed any indication of closure. No yellow caution cones, no maintenance cart, no staff members entering or exiting. "The sign says they reopen at 9:30. It's 10:22. "Sign's wrong." The lie was delivered without embarrassment, without any attempt at plausibility. Just raw power exercising itself because it could. Simone held Voss's gaze for 3 seconds, letting the silence communicate her understanding of exactly what was happening. "I'm noting the time and your response for my records." Something shifted in Voss's expression. The casual malice hardened into something more focused, more personal. She reached for the phone on her desk and spoke quietly into the receiver, her eyes never leaving Simone's face. The waiting began to feel different after that phone call. The elderly man shifted slightly away from where Simone sat, as though proximity to her might prove contagious. The new defendants who cycled through the room seemed to receive whispered warnings from the staff. And soon a small perimeter of empty space surrounded her bench. She documented everything: times, names, badge numbers, the specific language of each denial. Her pen moved across the margins of her papers in handwriting so small that casual observers would notice nothing unusual. At 10:31, Sergeant Brock Randall appeared. He entered the waiting area through a side door she had not previously seen anyone use. His uniform differed slightly from the other bailiffs, marking him as senior staff, and his posture conveyed absolute ownership of the space. This was a man who had learned to walk through rooms expecting obedience, and he had rarely been disappointed. He scanned the waiting area with practiced assessment, his gaze moving from face to face, lingering nowhere until it found Simone. Then it stopped. Held. Evaluated. Whatever Voss had said on the phone, Randall had found it interesting enough to investigate personally. He approached her bench without preamble, positioning himself directly in front of her seated figure. The stance was deliberate intimidation, forcing her to look up at him, establishing physical dominance through simple geometry. "Ma'am, step over here. Security concern." His voice carried easily across the quiet room. The other defendants pretended not to watch while watching intently. Simone rose from her seat. Her movements were controlled, unhurried, projecting neither aggression nor fear. She followed him to an open area near the vending machines, away from the cameras she had mapped earlier, in a corner where sight lines were limited. Hands out to the sides. She complied. The second screening in 4 hours. No explanation offered, no specific concern articulated. He began the pat-down. His technique violated every standard she had ever learned about professional search protocols. Hands moving too slowly, pressure too firm, fingers lingering in places that served no legitimate security purpose. That search exceeded the scope permitted under Florida Statute 901.211. Her voice remained steady, conversational. I did not consent to a pat-down. His smile showed teeth. You're in a courthouse. You consent by being here. The legal reasoning was nonsense, and they both knew it. But legal reasoning was not the point. The point was power. The point was establishing that she existed in this space only at his pleasure, subject to whatever treatment he decided to impose. I'd like to file a formal complaint. Talk to the bailiff station. I did. They're out of complaint forms. Sounds like a supply issue. Not my department. He completed his pat-down and stepped back, still smiling. Whatever he had been looking for, whatever reaction he had expected to provoke, her calm demeanor apparently disappointed him. His expression shifted from amusement to something harder. You should learn to cooperate better. People who make trouble here tend to have more trouble. You understand what I'm saying? I understand you're threatening me. I'm giving advice, free of charge. He walked away without waiting for response. His hand brushed her shoulder as he passed, the contact deliberate and possessive, a reminder that he could touch her whenever he wanted, and she could do nothing to stop him. Simone returned to her bench. Her pulse had not accelerated. Her breathing had not changed. She had trained herself in environments where survival depended on controlling physiological responses to stress, and a courthouse bully posed no particular challenge to that discipline. But she did note his badge number, 4471, filed alongside the time, the location, the specific language of his threat. The evidence was accumulating exactly as intended. At 11:47, almost 4 hours after her scheduled hearing time, Devin Meeks finally called her name. But instead of directing her toward courtroom 4B, he emerged from behind his window and approached her directly, a clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield. Ms. Adler, there's been a scheduling issue. She gathered her folder and rose to face him. What kind of issue? The officer on your citation can't appear today. Your case has been continued. I received confirmation for this date. System shows a conflict. Happens sometimes. Your new hearing date is... He consulted the clipboard, lips moving as he read. 6 weeks from today. You'll receive notification by mail. A verbal notification of continuance isn't valid under Florida Rule of Judicial Administration 2.545. I need documentation. The statute citation caught him off guard. His eyes flickered to her folder, to her clothes, reassessing whatever assumptions he had made about her education level, her sophistication, her willingness to accept bureaucratic runaround. I don't have time to... The rule is clear. Continuances require written notice specifying the reason and new date. I'm entitled to that documentation. She held his gaze until he looked away. Then she opened her folder and removed the hearing confirmation notice, holding it up so he could see the printed text. State of Florida versus Adler, Simone M. Case, number 2024, TC 4471. Hearing date, March 14, 2024, 8:00 a.m., courtroom 4B. Status confirmed. She lowered the paper. This is the documentation I received. I need equivalent documentation for any changes. Meeks shifted his weight from foot to foot, trapped between his instinct to dismiss her and his apparent uncertainty about the legal requirements she had cited. Finally, he retreated behind the familiar excuse. I'll have to check with the judge. He disappeared through the courtroom door. Simone returned to her bench and waited. Aware that the dynamics of this encounter had shifted slightly, she had demonstrated knowledge. Knowledge made her dangerous, and dangerous people receive different treatment in institutions designed to process compliant citizens. When Meeks returned 12 minutes later, he was not alone. Preston Cole walked 2 steps behind him, moving with the particular confidence of prosecutors everywhere. His suit cost more than most defendants in this building earned in a week. His lanyard displayed credentials marking him as Deputy District Attorney, Jefferson County. His expression combined professional courtesy with something colder beneath the surface. "Ms. Adler? I'm Preston Cole, Deputy District Attorney. I understand there's been some confusion about your hearing." "No confusion. I was scheduled for 8 o'clock. I've been waiting nearly 4 hours. Now I'm told my case is continued without documentation." Cole spread his hands in a gesture of practiced reasonableness. "These things happen. Busy docket, officers get called to emergencies, scheduling conflicts arise. The important thing is we get you rescheduled as quickly as possible. The important thing is following proper legal procedure." Something flickered across his face, irritation, quickly suppressed. "I noticed you've been asking a lot of questions, making the staff uncomfortable. I've been requesting things I'm legally entitled to." "See, that attitude?" He shook his head slowly. "That's what concerns me. Courts run on cooperation. When someone comes in with a chip on their shoulder, refusing to work with staff, citing statutes like they think they're an attorney," he let the implication hang. "Well, that raises questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about intent, about why someone would drive all the way down here for a minor registration violation and then spend 4 hours antagonizing every person they encounter. Makes people wonder if there's something else going on." The threat was elegantly constructed, vague enough to avoid specific accusation, specific enough to communicate that she had been identified as a problem requiring handling. Preston Cole had clearly handled such problems before. Simone let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds before responding. "Are you suggesting I've committed some offense beyond an expired registration?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing patterns, and I'm giving you the same advice Sergeant Randall gave you earlier. Cooperation makes everyone's life easier. Resistance makes everyone's life harder." His smile showed perfect teeth. "Your choice." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his message delivered with the confidence of someone who expected compliance. Meeks scuttled after him, casting one nervous glance back at Simone before disappearing through the courtroom door. The waiting area felt different now. The other defendants had abandoned any pretense of not watching. The elderly man rose from his bench and shuffled toward the exit without waiting for his case to be called. New arrivals were directed to seats as far from Simone as the room's geometry allowed. She had been marked. The invisible machinery of courthouse hierarchy had identified her as someone requiring special attention. Whatever happened next would not be accidental. At 12:14, Simone attempted the restroom request again. A different staff member occupied Voss's station now, a younger woman who seemed uncertain about the protocols. "I need to use the restroom." The woman glanced toward the hallway where Voss had disappeared. I think you need an escort? Let me check." She picked up the phone, spoke briefly, nodded several times. When she hung up, her expression had shifted from uncertain to apologetic. "Restrooms are closed for emergency maintenance. Should be fixed soon." The lie was transparent, but challenging it would accomplish nothing except further marking her as problematic. Simone thanked the woman and returned to her seat, where she continued documenting the denial alongside all the previous ones. At 12:27, Marlene Voss returned. She walked directly to Simone's bench, her posture broadcasting hostility before she spoke a single word. "You're wanted in courtroom 4B. My case was continued. Judge wants to see you anyway, now." No explanation, no context, just a command and the expectation of compliance. Simone gathered her folder and followed Voss through the courtroom doors. The hallway beyond smelled of aged carpet and recycled air. They passed doors marked with judge names, conference rooms, administrative offices. Finally, Voss stopped in front of a door with a small window at eye level. "Wait here." She disappeared inside. Simone could hear muffled voices through the door, but could not distinguish words. 60 seconds passed. 90. 2 minutes. When Voss emerged, she held the door open just wide enough for Simone to enter. The courtroom was smaller than expected, designed for the high-volume processing of minor cases rather than dramatic trials. Judge Harold Wynne sat behind an elevated bench, his black robe lending authority to an otherwise unremarkable face. 22 years on this bench had taught him exactly how much he could get away with. His eyes tracked Simone's approach with the evaluating gaze of someone who had already decided she was guilty of something. Ms. Adler. He did not use her first name, did not offer any courtesies of address, just the surname, flattened into a label rather than an identity. "Your Honor, I'm told you've been disruptive today. I've made lawful requests that were denied, Your Honor. I've documented procedural violations that I'll decide what's lawful in my courtroom." The interruption was deliberate, designed to establish who controlled this exchange. Simone stopped speaking and waited. Wynne studied her for several seconds, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You've been asking questions, citing statutes, making staff uncomfortable. That's not how things work here. In my courthouse, people cooperate. They follow instructions. They don't challenge every direction they receive with legal citations and attitude. Respectfully, Your Honor, I've exercised my right to— One more complaint about you, and I'll hold you in contempt. Understood?" The threat of contempt was itself improper. Contempt required conduct that obstructed the administration of justice, and nothing she had done met that standard. But pointing this out would only prove the accusation of attitude that Wynne was constructing. She lowered her eyes in a gesture that could be interpreted as submission. "Understood, Your Honor." He dismissed her with a wave. Voss escorted her back to the waiting area, wearing an expression of satisfied triumph. At 12:33, Simone discovered that her folder had disappeared. She had left it on the bench beside her seat before the courtroom summons. The citation, the hearing confirmation, her handwritten notes documenting every violation, every denial, every name and badge number, all of it gone. She approached Meeks at the clerk's window. "My file was on that bench." He did not look up from his computer. "I don't know anything about a file. There are cameras in this room. Those cameras haven't worked in months. Budget cuts." The lie was delivered with the same casual contempt as all the others. No investigation, no concern. Just dismissal and the implicit challenge. "What are you going to do about it?" Simone returned to her bench and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her phone remained in her pocket, where it had been since she arrived. The screen showed nothing of interest to a casual observer. But beneath the default apps and common functions, a recording application had been running since 6:47 that morning. Every conversation, every exchange, every threat and denial and fabricated excuse, all of it captured in digital clarity. They had taken her paper documentation. They could not take what they did not know existed. At 12:41, Preston Cole returned with paperwork that made the situation considerably worse. "Ms. Adler, I'm afraid we have a problem." She rose to face him, keeping her expression neutral despite the cold certainty settling in her stomach. Whatever came next had been planned, orchestrated. The morning's accumulation of provocations was leading somewhere specific. "During your interactions this morning, courthouse security observed you photographing secure areas." "I took no photographs." "We have a witness statement that says otherwise." He held up a document, official-looking, bearing what appeared to be a sworn affidavit. "That's a third-degree felony under Florida Statute 843.0855. Photographing secured areas of a detention facility." "This is a municipal courthouse, not a detention facility. That statute doesn't apply." "Let the judge decide that. In the meantime, you're being detained." The fabrication was elegant in its simplicity. A witness statement from a cooperative bailiff, a statute citation that sounded plausible to anyone unfamiliar with its actual scope, and now a detention that would allow them to search her property, seize her phone, potentially discover whatever evidence she had gathered against them. She understood with perfect clarity that she was being framed. Marlene Voss appeared at Cole's shoulder, her expression anticipating what came next. "We'll need to search your person and seize your phone as evidence." "I do not consent to a search. Under Florida v. Bostick, 501 U.S. 429, seizure requires probable cause or consent." "Witness statement provides probable cause," Cole said. "A statement alleging photography doesn't justify searching my body." "We'll let the judge decide that too." Sergeant Brock Randall stepped through the courtroom door. He had been waiting, Simone realized, positioned nearby, ready to respond when the signal came. His smile showed teeth. "Ma'am, you can cooperate or we can do this the hard way." Three of them now. Cole representing legal authority, Voss representing administrative control, Randall representing physical force, a perfect triangle of courthouse power designed to break resistance through overwhelming pressure. Simone's weight shifted slightly, an adjustment so subtle that none of them noticed. Her breathing remained steady. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Her eyes tracked distances, exit locations, camera positions. "I want to speak with an attorney before any search." "You're not under arrest," Cole said. "Just detained for investigation. Attorney can come later." Detention without arrest still triggers Fourth Amendment protections. Randall stepped forward, close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath. "You know what I think? I think you've spent all morning trying to cause problems, and I think it's time for you to learn what happens to people who cause problems in my courthouse." His hand shot out, seizing her arm above the elbow. The grip was meant to hurt, meant to establish physical dominance, meant to provoke a reaction that would justify escalation. Simone did not react. Her arm remained limp in his grasp, offering neither resistance nor compliance, simply existing as an object he was choosing to hold. "Remove your hand. You're committing battery under Florida Statute 784.03. I'm executing a lawful detention. A detention requires reasonable suspicion of a specific crime. Photographing, which I did not do, is not a crime in a public courthouse. Your witness statement is false, and I'll prove it." His grip tightened until she could feel bones grinding. "You're going to prove something, all right." He yanked her toward the courtroom door. The motion was violent enough to make her stumble, though she caught her balance almost instantly. Other defendants in the waiting area stared openly now, phones emerging from pockets, recording devices capturing what was happening. Randall saw the phones. His smile widened. "Anyone recording will be detained for obstruction. Courthouse policy." There was no such policy, but the threat worked. Phones disappeared back into pockets. Witnesses transformed themselves into see-nothing strangers, suddenly fascinated by the floor, the ceiling, anything except the woman being dragged toward a courtroom by a man who had clearly done this before. The hallway passed in a blur of institutional carpet and closed doors. Randall's grip never loosened. He shoved her through the entrance to courtroom 4B with enough force to make her stagger. Judge Wynn was on the bench, a hearing apparently in progress. A confused attorney stood at the podium, documents in hand, interrupted mid-sentence by the violent entrance. "What's the meaning of this interruption?" Randall stepped forward, positioning himself between Simone and the bench. "Disorderly defendant, Your Honor. Resisting courthouse security. She's been a problem all morning." "Your Honor, I am Simone Adler." She kept her voice level despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I was scheduled for traffic court this morning. My hearing was improperly continued. I've been detained without probable cause. I've been subjected to illegal searches. My property has been stolen, and now I'm being physically—" "Enough." Wynn's gavel struck the bench with a crack that silenced everything. "You're in contempt." "Your Honor, contempt requires willful obstruction. I've complied with every—" "I said enough." This story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. Hit that like button if you're ready for what happens next. The gavel struck again. Wynn's face had gone dark with anger, the composed judicial demeanor cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. "I warned you this morning about your attitude. I told you what would happen if I received one more complaint. You've spent the entire day antagonizing my staff, citing statutes like you think you know more than the people who run this courthouse. Now you're disrupting proceedings and resisting lawful detention. That's contempt. 30 days or $500. The sentence was illegal. Summary contempt required immediate disruption so severe that the court could not function without intervention. Nothing Simone had done met that standard. But appealing the ruling would require time, money, and access to legal resources that most defendants in this building could not afford, which was exactly the point. The contempt charge was a weapon, not a legal finding, a way to punish people who refused to submit quietly to institutional abuse. Simone opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Randall's hand closed on her shoulder, spinning her toward him with enough force to whip her head around. "You don't talk to the judge that way." His hand rose. She saw it coming. Had time to calculate trajectories, anticipate impact points, recognize that what was about to happen would change everything. She chose not to move. The slap connected with her left cheek, open palm, full force. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, freezing everyone present in a tableau of shock. Her head snapped sideways. She tasted copper. Her inner cheek had torn against her teeth, blood pooling where soft tissue met enamel. She did not stumble, did not cry out. Her weight had already shifted to the balls of her feet. Her hands remained at her sides, visible, non-threatening. She turned back to face Randall, blood visible now at the corner of her mouth. His expression showed something she recognized. The particular intoxication of someone who had just committed violence and faced no immediate consequence. The certainty that his badge protected him from any retaliation, any accountability, any challenge to his authority. He swung again. This time she moved. The armbar was textbook. Catch the wrist with her left hand, control the elbow with her right, redirect his momentum down and forward. The technique exploited physics rather than strength, turning his 240 pounds of aggressive force into the instrument of his own descent. His feet left the ground. He rotated over her hip in a movement so fluid that observers would later describe it as almost graceful. Then he hit the floor with an impact that drove the breath from his lungs in a single explosive grunt. She released him immediately, stepped back. Hands raised, palms open, fingers spread. The courtroom remained frozen, everyone processing what they had just witnessed. Self-defense under Florida Statute 776.012. Her voice was steady, clear, projected so that every camera phone still recording could capture the audio. "He struck first. I used proportional force. I am not resisting." Randall lay on his back, gasping for air, nose bleeding from where it had connected with the tile floor. His eyes stared at the ceiling with the particular confusion of someone who has just experienced something unprecedented. Wynn's gavel crashed down repeatedly, an attempt to restore order that no longer existed. Bailiffs surged forward, unsure whether to assist Randall or restrain Simone. The attorney at the podium had retreated to the far end of the counsel table, papers forgotten on the floor. In the gallery's front row, the woman in the gray blazer rose from her seat. She moved through the chaos with the unhurried confidence of someone who had planned for this moment. Her hand reached inside her jacket and emerged holding credentials that she displayed to the nearest bailiff. Whatever the credentials showed, the effect was immediate. The bailiff stepped aside, his entire posture shifting from aggressive to uncertain. The woman in gray approached the space where Simone stood with hands raised, surrounded by courthouse staff who no longer knew what they were supposed to do. "Ms. Adler," the woman's voice carried just enough to be heard over the fading chaos. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Simone met her eyes. In that exchange, more passed between them than any observer could have interpreted. Recognition, confirmation, the silent acknowledgement that everything was proceeding according to plan. "I think you're right," Simone said. Below them, Brock Randall finally managed to sit up. Blood continued streaming from his nose, painting his uniform shirt in spreading stains. His expression cycled through pain, confusion, and finally settled on rage. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice thick and nasal. "What the hell is going on here?" Neither woman answered him. In the hallway beyond the courtroom, footsteps approached. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. The sound of authority arriving to take control of a situation that had just escaped the control of the people who thought they owned it. The story was far from over, but for Sergeant Brock Randall and his colleagues, the ending had already been written. They simply did not know it yet. The conference room where they took her smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaning solution. White walls, fluorescent lights, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs facing each other across its scarred surface. The room was designed for interrogations, for breaking down resistance, for convincing people to confess to things they may or may not have done. Simone sat in the chair closest to the door, not by accident. In the 17 minutes since the courtroom incident, she had been separated from the woman in gray, processed through a confusion of protocols that no one seemed entirely certain about, and ultimately deposited here to wait. She used the time to conduct a damage assessment. Her cheek throbbed where Randall had struck her. The split skin inside her mouth continued to seep blood, though the flow had slowed. Minor injuries. Nothing that would require medical attention. Nothing that would impair her ability to continue. More importantly, she reviewed what she knew about the situation. Her phone remained in her pocket, apparently overlooked in the chaos of the courtroom. The recording application should still be running. That meant everything since the slap was preserved. Everything since her arrival that morning, actually. Over 6 hours of audio documenting the systematic violations she had endured. The door opened. Renata Okafor entered first. She was approximately 45, dressed in a suit that showed more wear than a successful attorney would typically tolerate, her face carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought losing battles for too long. She carried a leather portfolio stuffed with papers and moved with the efficient urgency of someone billing by the hour. "I'm Renata Okafor. I saw what happened in there. I'm a defense attorney. I've filed 14 complaints about this courthouse in the past 3 years. 14. She sat down across from Simone, spreading papers across the table with the practiced movements of someone who organized chaos for a living. "They're going to charge you with assault on a peace officer, battery, resisting, maybe contempt for whatever Wynne was ranting about. I can represent you, but we need to talk fast because they're going to want to book you, and the clock starts the moment they do." Simone studied her for 3 seconds, assessed the fatigue in her eyes, the passion beneath the exhaustion, the accumulated frustration of someone who believed in a system that kept proving itself unworthy of that belief. "What happened to your 14 complaints?" Okafor's laugh held no humor. "Lost, misfiled, administratively closed. Pick your euphemism. This courthouse has been operating the same way for 20 years. Defendants who cause problems get problems in return. Staff protects staff. Judges protect staff. Nobody outside this building cares what happens to people who come through these doors." She opened her portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. Each one bore the letterhead of the Florida Bar Association, the Jefferson County Circuit Court, or various oversight agencies. Complaint 2022 CC1104, filed March 3, 2022. Excessive force complaint against Sergeant Randall. Status: closed, no action. Complaint 2022 CC1847, filed June 17, 2022. Evidence tampering allegation, courtroom 4B. Status: administratively transferred, no record of final disposition. Complaint 2023 CC0094, filed January 12, 2023. Judicial misconduct, Judge Wynne. Status under review, 14 months and counting. She set the papers down. "That's not even all of them. I've got files going back 5 years. Over 40 defendants I've represented who experienced what you experience today. Illegal searches, fabricated charges, property theft, physical intimidation, and exactly 0 consequences for anyone involved. Why are you telling me this? Because you're different. Okafor leaned forward, her eyes searching Simone's face. I've seen hundreds of people go through this courthouse. Most of them break. They cry. They beg. They take whatever plea deal gets them out of here fastest. You got slapped by a 240-pound man and threw him on his back without changing expression. You cited statute numbers during a physical assault. You're not a typical defendant. So I'm asking, who are you really, and what are you doing here? Simone held her gaze for several seconds. Okafor had earned honesty, or at least partial honesty. I came here to document what you've been documenting for 5 years. I had reasons to believe this courthouse was engaged in systematic civil rights violations. I needed to confirm the pattern. Document for whom? Before Simone could answer, the door opened again. The woman in gray entered, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Her blazer was still perfectly pressed despite the chaos of the past hour. Her posture conveyed authority without aggression. She carried herself like someone who had been in rooms like this many times before, always as the one in control. Ms. Okafor, thank you for your assistance. I need to speak with Ms. Adler privately. Okafor's expression shifted to suspicion. I'm her attorney. Anything you say to her, you can say in front of me. That's her choice to make, not yours. Both women looked at Simone. A decision point. Reveal more than necessary or maintain cover until circumstances clarified. It's all right, Ms. Okafor. Thank you for everything. The attorney hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but something in Simone's expression must have communicated finality because she gathered her papers slowly, making a show of reluctance, before moving toward the door. I'll be outside, if you need me. The door closed behind her. The woman in gray remained standing for 3 seconds, then pulled out the chair Okafor had vacated and sat down. Deputy U.S. Marshal Elaine Pritchard. She did not display credentials, did not need to. Your principal is getting antsy, wants to know if the timeline has accelerated. The shift in conversation registered the change in circumstances. Cover no longer fully necessary. Communication possible through channels that civilians would not recognize. Tell him it just did. Pritchard nodded slowly. What Randall did in there was stupid. Spectacularly stupid. The kind of stupid that generates federal interest even without our involvement. Every phone in that courtroom was recording. The footage is already spreading. By tonight, it'll be national news. That complicates extraction. That creates opportunity. Pritchard pulled out her own phone, displaying a series of text messages. Justice Department is watching. If we move now while public attention is focused, we can invoke federal jurisdiction before state actors have time to coordinate a cover story. What about the evidence I've gathered? 3 months of documentation. Preserved. Your handler received automatic uploads through the secure channel. Nothing on your local device that can be compromised. She paused. The question is whether you're ready to reveal. Once we do, there's no going back. Cover is gone. Whatever happens next happens in the open. Simone touched her cheek, feeling the swelling beneath her fingers. In a few hours, the bruise would be visible. Physical evidence of what Randall had done, what this courthouse had done, what the system had allowed to happen for 2 decades. I'm ready. Pritchard's phone buzzed. She checked the message, and something in her expression shifted. Then we move now. The U.S. Attorney is filing emergency papers within the hour. Federal agents are en route. By the time Randall and his friends figure out what's happening, it'll be too late to destroy evidence or coordinate testimony. She stood, moving toward the door with purpose. Wait here. I'll return with the team. The door closed behind her. Simone sat alone in the interrogation room, surrounded by institutional walls and fluorescent buzzing, and allowed herself one deep breath. 3 months of surveillance. 47 documented violations. 6 officers with patterns of abuse stretching back years. A judge who had weaponized contempt citations against black defendants at nearly 3 times the rate of his colleagues. An entire courthouse operating as a machine for extracting compliance through intimidation, humiliation, and violence. And now, finally, the evidence existed to prove it. She pulled out her phone and checked the recording application. 6 hours, 43 minutes of continuous audio. Time-stamped, location tagged. Admissible under Florida Statute 934.03, subsection 2C, the exception for documenting criminal conduct. They had taken her paper documentation. They had threatened her with fabricated charges. They had struck her in open court. And none of it had mattered, because Simone Adler had not come to this courthouse as a victim. She had come as the instrument of accountability, and in approximately 90 minutes, everyone who had participated in the abuse she had documented was going to learn exactly what that meant. The holding room's silence stretched for 47 minutes. Simone used the time productively, reviewing the mental catalog of evidence she had accumulated, organizing the testimony she would eventually provide, preparing for the transition from observer to witness. She heard them before she saw them. Multiple footsteps in the hallway, moving with the coordinated purpose of trained professionals. Then the door opened, and everything accelerated. Deputy Marshal Pritchard entered first, followed by 2 men in the distinctive blue windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Behind them came a 4th figure she recognized from briefing photographs, Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Marsh, a career prosecutor whose conviction rate in civil rights cases exceeded 90%. Marsh carried a sealed envelope in one hand and a tablet in the other. Her expression combined legal precision with something that might have been anticipation. Ms. Adler, or should I say, Special Agent Adler. The words fell into silence like stones into still water. The revelation was complete, the cover finally unnecessary. Special Agent is fine. Marsh approached the table and set down the envelope. I have here a federal warrant authorizing your investigation, signed by Magistrate Judge Elena Cortez, Southern District of Florida, December 14, 2023. Duration, 90 days. Your evidence collection falls entirely within authorized parameters. She opened the tablet and displayed a document Simone recognized. The case summary she had compiled over 3 months of undercover work. FBI Case File 24, CV-1847, Investigation into Civil Rights Violations at Jefferson County Courthouse. Documented subjects include Sergeant Brock Randall, Chief Bailiff Marlene Voss, Deputy District Attorney Preston Cole, Court Clerk Devin Meeks, and Presiding Judge Harold Wynn. Documented violations total 47 across 3 months of surveillance. Pritchard stepped forward. The footage from today's courtroom incident is spreading across social media, multiple angles, clear audio, Randall's assault on you, followed by your defensive response. Public attention is focused. News outlets are requesting comments. This is our window. What's the timeline? Agents are securing the courthouse as we speak, Marsh said. No one leaves until we've preserved all physical and digital evidence. Randall is being taken into federal custody within the hour. The others will be detained for questioning. Simone stood, feeling the shift in her own posture from passive observer to active participant. 3 months of suppressing her trained instincts, of absorbing abuse without response, of documenting violations while pretending to be helpless. All of it had led to this moment. I'll need to provide a formal statement. After. Marsh closed the tablet. Right now, I need you in the administrator's office. The subjects are being assembled. They don't know yet what's happening. I want you there when they find out. The walk from the holding room to the administrative wing took 4 minutes. They passed through hallways that now contained federal agents at every intersection, their presence transforming the familiar courthouse architecture into something closer to a crime scene. Staff members who had ignored Simone that morning now watched her pass with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. She recognized some of them. The clerk who had denied her access to complaint forms, the bailiff who had conducted the first illegal pat-down, the security guard who had looked away when Randall grabbed her arm, all of them witnessing the reversal of power that was unfolding around them. The administrator's office occupied a corner of the building's 2nd floor. Through the door's window, Simone could see the assembled subjects. Sheriff Dale Buckley in civilian clothes, clearly called from somewhere on short notice. Judge Wynne, still in his robes, face gray with confusion. Preston Cole, jacket removed, sweat visible on his forehead despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Marlene Voss, arms crossed, radiating defiance. And Sergeant Brock Randall, an ice pack pressed to his face, blood still visible on his uniform shirt. Marsh knocked once, then entered without waiting for response. The room fell silent. 5 faces turned toward the doorway, tracking the entry of federal officials with the wariness of prey animals recognizing predators. Buckley spoke first. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking law enforcement official in any room. "What's the meaning of this? This woman assaulted one of my officers. If anyone should be in custody, it's her." Simone stepped through the door behind Marsh. She had changed nothing about her appearance. The same clothes she had worn that morning, the same posture of contained stillness. But everything else had changed, and everyone in the room recognized it. "This woman," Marsh said, "is Special Agent Simone Adler, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division, and your officer is about to be arrested." The silence that followed held weight. Simone watched comprehension spread across 5 faces at different speeds. Cole understood first, his expression cycling through denial and calculation before settling on something like despair. Voss's defiance crumbled into shock. Buckley's authority deflated visibly, his posture shrinking as the implications registered. Wynne found his voice. "This is absurd. She was in my courtroom this morning as a defendant. She disrupted proceedings. I held her in contempt. You can't simply—" "I was in your courtroom documenting your court's systematic violation of defendants' civil rights." Simone kept her voice level, professional, allowing the facts to carry their own weight. "I have 3 months of evidence. Today was confirmation of the pattern." She stepped forward, placing her credentials on the table where everyone could see them. FBI badge. Special Agent identification. The physical proof of everything they had failed to anticipate. "What you did to me today, you've done to 47 other people over the past 3 years. The illegal searches, the fabricated charges, the stolen property, the physical assaults." She met each person's eyes in turn. "The difference is that I documented everything. And now, you're going to answer for it. The moment of justice you've been waiting for is here. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss how this all ends." Cole attempted recovery. "Whatever you think you have, it won't hold up. You obtained evidence through deception. Any competent defense attorney—" "I obtained evidence through authorized undercover investigation." Marsh pulled out the warrant Simone had seen earlier, displaying it for the room. "Federal Warrant 24 SW0847. Authorization for undercover investigation of Jefferson County Courthouse personnel. Issuing Judge Honorable Elena Cortez. Date December 14, 2023. Duration 90 days. Every recording, every photograph, every document. Properly authorized and preserved." She set the warrant on the table beside Simone's credentials. Additionally, Florida Statute 934.03, subsection 2C, provides explicit exception for 2-party consent requirements when recording criminal conduct. Everything Agent Adler captured today falls squarely within that exception. Randall finally spoke. His voice came out thick and nasal through the ice pack, but his rage was unmistakable. "She assaulted me. You all saw it. She threw me to the ground." "You struck her first." Pritchard's response was immediate and flat. "In a courtroom full of witnesses, after she had repeatedly stated for the record that she was not resisting. Self-defense under Florida Statute 776.012, proportional force in response to battery. The footage is unambiguous." "The footage," Randall started, "is everywhere." Pritchard pulled out her phone and held it up, displaying a social media feed. 11 million views in the past hour. Every major news outlet is running the story. "You're already famous, Sergeant. The question now is whether you'd like to be famous for civil rights violations or for cooperating with a federal investigation." One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "Brock Randall, you're under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law. Title 18 U.S. Code Section 242. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The recitation of Miranda rights transformed the scene. Randall's expression shifted from rage to something closer to panic as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The ice pack fell to the floor, forgotten. "Sheriff, tell them they can't do this." His voice rose. "Sheriff!" Buckley did not respond. He stood frozen, watching the federal agents secure Randall's hands behind his back, understanding that anything he said now could be used against him later. Wynn attempted one final assertion of authority. "I have judicial immunity. Whatever allegations you're making, you cannot—" "Judicial immunity protects judicial decisions, Your Honor." Simone's response was quiet, but carried clearly. "It does not protect conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. It does not protect coordinating with courthouse staff to target defendants based on race. And it does not protect you from referral to the Florida Judicial Qualifications Commission. That referral was filed this morning." She stepped closer to the bench where Wynn still sat in his robes, symbols of authority that now seemed more like costume than investiture. 22 years on this bench, 82% of your contempt citations issued against black defendants. The county average is 31%. Pattern and practice. That's not judicial discretion, Your Honor. That's discrimination, and discrimination isn't protected by immunity. Wynn's face had gone from gray to white, the color of someone watching their entire career, their entire identity, dissolve in front of them. Cole cleared his throat. "I'd like to speak with my attorney before making any statements." "That's your right." Marsh's voice held no sympathy. "But I should inform you that your office is being served with preservation orders as we speak. Every file, every email, every communication related to this courthouse for the past 5 years. We know about the coordinated dismissals, Mr. Cole. We know about the plea bargains that buried excessive force complaints. We have records you didn't know existed." She turned to address the entire room. "Here's what happens next. Sergeant Randall goes to federal detention pending arraignment. The rest of you are being detained for questioning. Your attorneys can meet you at the federal building. Until then, no one leaves. No communications. No attempts to coordinate stories or destroy evidence." Pritchard nodded to the agents. "Process them." What followed was the systematic dismantling of power structures that had operated unchecked for 2 decades. One by one, the subjects of Simone's investigation were escorted from the administrator's office. Voss went quietly, her earlier defiance replaced by something like numbness. Cole demanded his phone repeatedly, until an agent informed him that the phone was now evidence. Wynn had to be physically assisted from his chair, his legs apparently unwilling to support him. Buckley was the last to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Simone. "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "How long were you watching us?" 3 months. Every day. Documenting everything you did to the people who came through this courthouse expecting justice and receiving something very different." He held her gaze for a moment, and in his eyes she saw the particular tragedy of someone who had built their entire career on a foundation of corruption and was only now realizing how thoroughly that foundation had rotted. Then he turned and walked out, flanked by federal agents, his authority stripped away with every step. The office emptied until only Simone, Marsh, and Pritchard remained. The silence felt different now. Not the charged tension of confrontation, but the quiet aftermath of a battle decisively won. Marsh gathered her documents. "Press conference in 3 hours, U.S. Attorney wants you there, visible, showing the public who brought this case to justice." Simone touched her cheek. The swelling had become more pronounced. The bruise would be visible by evening. Physical evidence that would accompany every news story, every analysis piece, every discussion of what had happened in Jefferson County Courthouse. "I'll be ready." Pritchard's phone buzzed. She checked the message and her expression shifted. "The footage. It's at 27 million views now. Every major network is requesting interviews. This is going to be the biggest civil rights prosecution in Florida history." She looked at Simone with something like respect. "You took a lot of abuse to make this happen. 3 months of watching you let them treat you like that. I don't know how you stayed calm." Simone considered the question. The answer was complicated, rooted in experiences that predated her FBI career, in training that had prepared her for circumstances far worse than courthouse bullies and corrupt officials. "They thought they were breaking me down," she said finally. "They didn't understand that every violation, every insult, every time they touched me without consent, they were building their own case. They were documenting their own guilt. I just had to stay still long enough to let them do it." Pritchard nodded slowly. "Navy Special Warfare. 8 years. I read your file. Silver Star for actions in classified operations. Most decorated female operator in your unit's history." She paused. "What Randall did to you today, that wasn't the worst thing you've survived. Not even close." The words hung in the air, carrying weight that none of them needed to elaborate. Outside the office windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse parking lot. Federal vehicles filled spaces that had been empty that morning. Officers who had arrived for routine shifts found themselves witnesses to the dismantling of the institution they served. The building itself seemed changed, diminished, stripped of the assumed authority that had made its abuses possible. Simone walked to the window and looked out at the transformation taking place. News vans were arriving, satellite dishes extending toward the sky. Reporters gathered behind barricades that had appeared from somewhere, their cameras pointed at the building where decades of corruption was finally facing accountability. She thought about the 47 victims documented in her case file, the people who had been searched illegally, charged falsely, beaten, humiliated, their lives disrupted by a system that should have protected them. Many of them would never fully recover. Some had already disappeared into the larger machinery of criminal justice, their cases buried beneath plea bargains and administrative closures. This investigation would not undo their suffering. Federal prosecution would not erase what had been done to them. Some form of justice might eventually emerge from the legal process now beginning, but justice was always imperfect, always incomplete, always arriving too late to prevent the harm it sought to address. But it was still justice, still accountability, still a signal that abuse of power carried consequences, even when that power wore badges and robes. Marsh joined her at the window. 30 minutes until the attorney calls. You should eat something. This is going to be a long night." "I know. And after tonight, a long process. Trials, appeals, civil litigation. The union will fight everything. Qualified immunity arguments, procedural challenges. It could take years before any of them see real consequences." "I know that too." Marsh studied her profile for a moment. "Why did you take this assignment? You could have had any posting. High-profile cases, international operations. Instead, you spent 3 months letting courthouse bullies push you around. Why?" The question deserved an honest answer. Simone provided one. "Because this is where it matters most. The federal cases, the international operations, those are important. But this," she gestured at the building around them, "this is where ordinary people meet the system. This is where they learn whether justice means anything or whether it's just a word we use to make ourselves feel better about power. If we can't fix this, the rest doesn't matter." Marsh absorbed this in silence. Then she nodded once, a gesture of understanding rather than agreement. 3 hours, she said. Then we show everyone what justice looks like when it finally arrives. She walked away, leaving Simone alone at the window. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. The shadows continued lengthening across the parking lot, and somewhere in the building behind her, the people who had thought themselves untouchable were beginning to understand just how wrong they had been. The story was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The arrests today were only the first step in a process that would stretch across months, possibly years. There would be setbacks, complications, moments when the system's instinct toward self-protection would threaten to overwhelm the pursuit of accountability. But for now, in this moment, watching the sun set on Jefferson County Courthouse, Simone allowed herself to feel something close to satisfaction. She had come here to document abuse of power. She had succeeded. And everyone who had participated in that abuse was about to learn what happened when the watchers finally watched back. The press conference took place on the steps of the federal building at 6:15 that evening. United States Attorney Diana Marsh stood at the podium, flanked by FBI agents and representatives from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Behind her, the building's facade caught the last light of sunset, its limestone walls glowing orange and gold. Today's arrests represent the beginning, not the end, of our investigation into civil rights violations at Jefferson County Courthouse. Marsh's voice carried clearly across the assembled reporters. The FBI has documented a pattern of abuse targeting vulnerable defendants. We will follow this evidence wherever it leads. Cameras flashed continuously. Reporters shouted questions. The controlled chaos of a major announcement played out against the backdrop of institutional architecture designed to project permanence and authority. Simone stood at the edge of the platform, visible but not central. This was not her moment for the spotlight. The case would speak for itself. The evidence would carry its own weight. She did not need to perform outrage or satisfaction for the cameras. A reporter spotted her and called out, "Agent Adler, how does it feel to have been targeted by the same system you were investigating?" The question cut through the general noise, drawing attention. Cameras swiveled toward her position. Marsh paused in her prepared remarks, allowing the interruption. Simone stepped to a secondary microphone. She waited until the chaos settled into expectant silence. "It feels like confirmation." Her voice was level, without dramatics. "For 3 months, I documented what happens to people who pass through that courthouse. Today, I experienced it myself. The illegal searches, the fabricated charges, the physical violence. Everything I witnessed happening to others, they did to me. Which means the pattern is real. The abuse is systemic, and the evidence is undeniable." She paused, letting the words land. 47 people over 3 years. That's just what we've documented. The real number is almost certainly higher. For every victim who filed a complaint, there are probably 10 who didn't, who couldn't, who were too scared, too beaten down, too convinced that nothing would ever change. Her voice hardened slightly. "Something has changed now. The people responsible are in custody. The evidence has been preserved, and this investigation will continue until everyone who participated in these abuses faces consequences." She stepped back from the microphone. Marsh resumed her prepared remarks. The cameras returned their attention to the official spokesperson. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a recognition that the woman who had just spoken carried authority beyond her words. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes. Questions about the specific charges, about the timeline of investigation, about what defendants could expect if they had cases pending in the compromised courthouse. Marsh handled each inquiry with practiced precision, revealing enough to satisfy curiosity while protecting the ongoing investigation. As the event wound down, Renata Okafor approached Simone at the edge of the platform. The defense attorney had been watching from the public area, her expression cycling through emotions that seemed to span her entire 5-year struggle against the courthouse she had been fighting alone. 14 complaints, she said quietly. 5 years. And you did in 3 months what I couldn't accomplish in all that time. You laid the groundwork. Simone met her eyes directly. Your complaints, your documentation, your refusal to stop filing even when nothing happened. That's what told us there was something here worth investigating. That's what brought federal attention in the first place. Okafor's expression shifted towards something like doubt. My complaints went nowhere. They went into files that someone eventually read, files that generated enough concern to justify a full-scale investigation. Simone placed a hand on the attorney's shoulder. You didn't fail, Ms. Okafor. You planted seeds. Sometimes seeds take time to grow. The older woman blinked rapidly, processing this reframe of her years of frustration. What happens now to my clients who went through that courthouse? Case review. Every defendant processed by the subjects of this investigation will have their cases examined. Anyone who was wrongly convicted based on fabricated evidence or coerced testimony will have grounds for appeal. It's going to take time, but the process starts now. Okafor nodded slowly. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not humor exactly. More like release. The sound of someone finally exhaling after holding their breath for far too long. I'm going to need to hire more staff. She shook her head. The calls are going to start tonight. Everyone I've ever represented at that courthouse. Everyone I couldn't help before. They're all going to want to know if this changes anything for them. It changes everything, Simone said. Not immediately, not completely, but it changes everything. The sun had fully set by the time the press conference ended. The federal building's lights illuminated the steps where Marsh had spoken. News crews began packing equipment. The crowd of onlookers dispersed into the evening. Simone remained on the steps, watching the city transition into night. Somewhere across town, Brock Randall sat in federal detention, awaiting arraignment. His colleagues faced questioning that would stretch into the early hours. Judge Wynn had been released to his attorney, but remained under investigation, his judicial career effectively over regardless of whether criminal charges ultimately stuck. The system was responding. Slowly, grudgingly, but responding. It was not enough. It would never be enough to undo what had been done to the victims of this courthouse. Justice delayed was still justice denied. The years of abuse could not be erased by federal indictments. But it was something. A beginning. A crack in the wall of institutional protection that had shielded wrongdoers for 2 decades. Simone's phone buzzed. A message from Agent Marcus Tate, her handler throughout the investigation. Good work today. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. She smiled slightly at the understatement. Tomorrow would bring the real work, formal statements, evidence cataloging, preparation for the legal battles that would consume the next several years. The arrests were dramatic, but prosecution was mundane. Conviction required patience. She was ready for the patience, had been ready for 3 months of absorbing abuse without response, would remain ready for however long it took to see this through. That was what justice required. Not dramatic confrontations or heroic moments, just the steady, unglamorous work of documentation and procedure. The willingness to be boring in service of something important. She started walking toward her car, parked blocks away in a public garage to maintain her cover identity's appearance of limited resources. The city's evening traffic moved around her, people heading home from work, families going out for dinner, the ordinary rhythms of life that continued regardless of what had happened in courtrooms and conference rooms. One of those ordinary people had been in that courthouse this morning, scheduled for a routine traffic violation. Expected nothing except bureaucratic inconvenience. Instead, they would have witnessed something historic. Simone wondered what they were thinking now, whether they understood what they had seen, whether it would change anything about how they viewed the institutions that claimed to serve them. Probably not. Most people moved through their lives trusting that systems worked, that authorities were legitimate, that the structures around them deserved the power they wielded. It took direct experience, or investigation, or tragedy, to reveal how fragile that trust actually was, how easily power corrupted, how readily institutions protected themselves at the expense of the people they claimed to serve. She had learned those lessons in places far from courthouses, in operations where the difference between legitimate authority and raw power was measured in body counts, where the symbols of law meant nothing and only outcomes mattered. Jefferson County Courthouse was not a war zone, but the dynamics were the same. Power without accountability, authority without oversight, the strong preying on the weak because no one stopped them, until someone did. Her car waited where she had left it, unmolested despite the morning's chaos. She unlocked the door, settled into the driver's seat, and sat for a moment in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring complications. The union would file grievances. Defense attorneys would mount challenges. Political pressure would emerge from unexpected directions. The clean narrative of today's arrests would become the messy reality of prolonged legal combat. But tonight, she allowed herself this moment, the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished, the knowledge that her work had mattered, the understanding that somewhere in the city, people who had been victimized by this courthouse were watching the news and realizing that someone had finally fought for them. She started the car and pulled into traffic, heading toward the temporary apartment she had maintained throughout the investigation. There would be no sleep tonight, probably. Too much adrenaline. Too many details to process. But there would be tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days that followed until this case reached whatever conclusion the legal system ultimately delivered. She was ready for all of them. The highway stretched before her, tail lights forming rivers of red in the darkness. The city's skyline glittered against the night sky, all glass and steel and artificial light, beautiful in its way, a monument to human ambition and human achievement. And beneath that beauty, the same struggles that had always defined human civilization: power and resistance, justice and corruption, the endless negotiation between what society claimed to value and what it actually rewarded. Simone had chosen her side in that negotiation, had committed her training, her skills, her capacity for patience and precision to the pursuit of accountability. It was not glamorous work, not the dramatic heroism of war stories or action movies, just the steady accumulation of evidence. The willingness to document wrongdoing until that documentation became undeniable. But it was necessary work, work that mattered, work that made the gap between society's values and society's actions just slightly smaller. One courthouse at a time, one corrupt official at a time, one victim at a time, receiving the justice that should have been theirs all along. The exit for her apartment complex appeared ahead. She signaled, changed lanes, and left the highway behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tonight, she had earned her rest. The morning after changed everything and nothing. Simone arrived at the FBI field office at 6:47 a.m., the same time she had arrived at the courthouse 24 hours earlier. The symmetry felt deliberate, though she had not planned it. Some rhythms established themselves without conscious thought. The building's lobby held a different energy than the day before. Agents moved with purpose that suggested overnight developments. Coffee cups accumulated on desks. The particular tension of an active investigation filled every corner, every conversation, every glance exchanged between colleagues who understood they were participating in something significant. Agent Marcus Tate met her at the elevator bank. He was 53, 27 years with the Bureau, the kind of handler who had seen enough operations go wrong to appreciate the ones that went right. His expression combined satisfaction with the wariness of someone who knew complications were coming. National news picked it up overnight, every major network. The footage is everywhere. He handed her a tablet displaying media coverage. 34 million views on the original video. Another 60 million across various reposts and commentary. You're famous. Simone scrolled through the headlines. Courthouse cop slaps woman, gets thrown to ground. Undercover FBI agent exposes years of abuse. Florida courthouse corruption scandal rocks judicial system. The coverage varied in accuracy, but agreed on the essential narrative. Something rotten had been exposed, and accountability was finally arriving. The union filed their first grievance at midnight, Tate continued as they walked toward the conference room. Randall's attorney is demanding immediate release on grounds of entrapment. Cole's people are already floating plea discussions, and the Judicial Qualifications Commission called twice this morning asking for our evidence files. Which files are they getting? The ones we want them to have. For now. He stopped outside the conference room door. Listen, what you did yesterday was exceptional. 3 months of documented abuse, culminating in a public incident that removed any possibility of quiet dismissal. That's textbook. But the textbook part is over. What comes next is going to be messy. I know. Do you? Because the system you just exposed is going to fight back, not with slaps and illegal searches, with lawyers and procedures and political pressure. They're going to try to make this about you instead of about them. Your methods, your background, anything they can find to shift the narrative. Simone met his eyes directly. Let them try. The conference room held 7 people when she entered. Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Marsh occupied the head of the table, surrounded by case files that had grown overnight. 2 FBI analysts flanked her, their laptops displaying evidence catalogs. Deputy Marshal Pritchard sat near the window, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in tones too quiet to overhear. And at the far end, someone Simone had not expected. Director Elena Vasquez from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, whose presence suggested this case had escalated beyond regional significance. Agent Adler. Vasquez rose to shake her hand. I flew in this morning. What you've documented here has implications beyond Jefferson County. We're seeing similar patterns in preliminary data from 3 other Florida jurisdictions. This may be the tip of something much larger. The words landed with weight that transformed the room's atmosphere. Not just one corrupt courthouse, potentially a network, a system of systems, each protecting the others through mutual complicity and shared silence. Marsh spread documents across the table. Let's start with what we have confirmed. Simone, walk us through the evidence chain from yesterday. The next 3 hours consisted of methodical documentation review. Every recording, every photograph, every notation Simone had made during her 3 months undercover. The analysts had organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline that stretched from her first day at the courthouse through the previous afternoon's arrests. December 17, 2023, 9:14 a.m. Simone read from the transcript of her first recorded interaction. Subject Voss conducts secondary screening without documented cause. Quote, random selection, she stated. End quote. Of the 7 defendants who passed through security during my observation window, I was the only person of color. I was also the only person selected for secondary screening. She turned the page. December 17, 2023, 10:22 a.m. Subject Randall conducts pat-down search exceeding scope permitted under Florida Statute 901.211. Physical contact included areas with no conceivable security justification. When I asked for the legal basis of the search, Subject Randall responded, quote, you're in a courthouse. You consent by being here. End quote. This statement contradicts established Fourth Amendment precedent regarding consent searches. The pattern continued through January, February, early March. Dozens of incidents, hundreds of small violations, each one documented with the precision of someone trained to gather evidence in hostile environments. January 9, 2024, 2:37 p.m. Another page, another recording. Subject Meeks deliberately misfiled case documents for defendant Marcus Jerome Wells, causing Mr. Wells to miss his hearing date. When Mr. Wells attempted to reschedule, Subject Meeks informed him that failure to appear would result in a bench warrant. Mr. Wells was arrested 2 days later at his workplace. The arrest was captured on employer security footage, which shows Mr. Wells offering no resistance. He sustained injuries during transport that required medical attention. Vasquez leaned forward. Do we have contact information for Mr. Wells? He's on our witness list. Released after 3 days when the original documentation error was discovered. No charges filed against anyone responsible for the error. No compensation for lost wages or medical expenses. That's going to change. The evidence review continued until noon. By then, the scope of documented abuse had expanded beyond what any single prosecution could address. Civil rights violations, evidence tampering, coordinated false testimony, illegal detention, physical assault. Each category contained multiple incidents, multiple victims, multiple perpetrators. Marsh organized the charges by defendant. Randall faces the most serious exposure, 18 documented instances of excessive force or illegal search. The assault on Agent Adler adds battery charges. We're looking at potential sentences totaling decades if convicted on all counts. His attorney will argue qualified immunity, one of the analysts noted. Qualified immunity protects officers from civil liability, Simone responded, not criminal prosecution, and it requires that the officer reasonably believe their conduct was lawful. Nothing about yesterday's assault was reasonable. He struck me in open court after I had clearly stated I was not resisting. That's not a good faith mistake. That's intentional battery. Pritchard ended her phone call and rejoined the discussion. Update from detention. Randall's not cooperating. His union rep is advising him to stay silent pending legal strategy, but Cole is showing signs of wanting to deal. What's he offering? Testimony against Wynn in exchange for reduced charges. Says he has emails proving the judge directed staff to target specific defendants for additional scrutiny. Quote, "The ones who look like they might cause problems." End quote. The room absorbed this information. Emails would constitute documentary evidence of discriminatory intent, the kind of proof that was often impossible to obtain. If Cole was telling the truth, his testimony could strengthen the case against Wynn significantly. What does he want in return? Marsh asked. Misdemeanor plea. No jail time. Resignation from the DA's office with ability to maintain his law license in other jurisdictions. That's generous for someone who participated in systematic civil rights violations. He knows how to negotiate, and he knows his testimony is valuable. The discussion continued through lunch, which arrived as sandwiches delivered to the conference room. No one suggested taking a break. The momentum of the investigation demanded continuous attention. If you're following this case unfold, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how it all ends. By 2 o'clock, the evidence had been organized into 3 distinct tracks. Criminal prosecution of individual officers, which would proceed through the federal court system over the coming months. Administrative action against Judge Wynn, which would involve the Judicial Qualifications Commission and potentially the Florida Supreme Court. And civil litigation on behalf of victims, which would be coordinated through a newly formed task force with representation from multiple advocacy organizations. There's something else, Simone said during a brief pause in the proceedings. Something that doesn't fit the pattern we've documented. She pulled up a file on the shared screen. An incident report from 2 years earlier. Case number 2022 IA 743. The document bore the letterhead of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office Internal Affairs Division. Marcus Jerome Wells, the defendant whose case was deliberately misfiled. After his release, he filed a complaint against the courthouse staff. Standard procedure. The complaint was assigned to Internal Affairs for investigation. She scrolled to the next page. Investigation findings. Unsubstantiated. No evidence of intentional misconduct. Recommendation. No action required. That's consistent with what we've seen, Marsh said. Complaints get filed, investigations go nowhere. Except for this. Simone highlighted a section of the document. The investigating officer's notes. Body cam footage was requested from the date of Mr. Wells's arrest. The request was logged, but the footage was never provided. According to the file, it was, quote, unavailable due to technical malfunction, end quote. Equipment failures happen. They do, but I checked the maintenance logs for the department's body camera system. No malfunctions were reported during the relevant time period, and the officer who arrested Mr. Wells, Deputy Nathan Cross, had no other instances of camera failure in his entire career. Just this one. Just this case. The implication hung in the air. Missing footage suggested destroyed footage. Destroyed footage suggested something worth destroying. Something that would have contradicted the official narrative. Something that might have revealed what actually happened during Marcus Jerome Wells's arrest. Pritchard pulled up additional records on her laptop. Cross is still with the department, promoted to sergeant 6 months after the Wells incident. Of course he was. Vasquez made a note. Add Cross to the investigation and find Marcus Jerome Wells. Whatever happened to him, he deserves to know we're looking into it. The afternoon brought developments that accelerated the investigation's timeline. At 3:47, Preston Cole's attorney formally requested a proffer session, the preliminary step toward cooperation agreements. At 4:15, The Judicial Qualifications Commission announced it was suspending Judge Wynne pending the outcome of their investigation, effectively removing him from the bench without requiring criminal conviction. And at 5 o'clock, Sheriff Dale Buckley held a press conference announcing his retirement, effective immediately. The retirement was transparently strategic. Buckley had not been directly implicated in the documented violations, but his oversight of the courthouse security staff made him vulnerable to questions about what he knew and when. By retiring before those questions could be formally asked, he preserved his pension and avoided the spectacle of public accountability. "He's going to walk away clean," Tate observed as they watched the press conference on the office television. 23 years in law enforcement, most of it overseeing a department that systematically abused citizens, and he gets to retire with full benefits and a speech about public service. For now. Simone's voice held no emotion. The civil suits are just beginning. His retirement doesn't protect him from personal liability, and the victim's attorneys are already requesting his deposition. That could take years. Justice often does. The press conference ended with Buckley thanking his colleagues for their service and expressing confidence that the department would emerge stronger from this challenging period. The language was carefully crafted to acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting responsibility, to promise reform without specifying changes, to sound cooperative while committing to nothing. It was the vocabulary of institutional self-preservation. Simone had heard it many times before, in many contexts. The words changed, but the meaning remained constant. We will protect ourselves first, address accountability second, and hope the public's attention moves elsewhere before real consequences arrive. But this time, the public's attention was not moving elsewhere. The footage from the courtroom had achieved the rare status of genuinely viral content, shared and reshared across platforms, analyzed by legal commentators, discussed in living rooms and workplaces across the country. The image of Randall striking her, followed by the controlled precision of her response, had become a symbol of something larger than one incident in one courthouse. By evening, the story had evolved beyond local news. National outlets were connecting the Jefferson County case to broader patterns of courthouse abuse documented across the country. Advocacy organizations were using the footage as evidence for reform proposals they had been pushing for years. Politicians were issuing statements, some calling for investigation, others defending law enforcement, all of them recognizing that this moment required public positioning. Simone watched none of it. She remained in the conference room until 8 o'clock, reviewing evidence, preparing for depositions, building the case file that would eventually go before grand juries and judges and juries of citizens. The dramatic footage was useful for generating attention, but attention alone did not produce convictions. Only evidence did that. Only the steady accumulation of documented wrongdoing, organized and presented with precision that left no room for reasonable doubt. At 8:15, Tate appeared in the doorway. "Go home. Get some actual sleep. Tomorrow is going to be longer than today." "I'm fine." "You're running on adrenaline. That works for about 48 hours, then it crashes. I've seen it happen to agents who thought they were fine right up until they weren't." He gestured toward the door. "Go." "That's not a suggestion." She went. The drive to her temporary apartment took 20 minutes through light evening traffic. The building was anonymous, a mid-rise complex in a neighborhood chosen for its unremarkability. No one who lived there paid attention to neighbors. No one asked questions. The perfect environment for someone maintaining a cover identity that was no longer necessary, but had not yet been formally abandoned. Her apartment held the minimal furnishings of temporary residence: a bed, a desk, a chair. Kitchen supplies sufficient for basic meals. Nothing personal. Nothing that suggested a life beyond the investigation that had consumed her for 3 months. She stood at the window, looking out at the city's lights, and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion she had been suppressing since the previous morning. Her cheek still ached where Randall had struck her. The bruise had fully developed now, a purple-black mark that would take days to fade. Physical evidence of what had happened. A reminder that would greet her every time she looked in a mirror. Sleep came eventually, restless and populated by dreams she would not remember upon waking. The city continued its nighttime rhythms around her. Somewhere, attorneys were preparing arguments. Somewhere, victims were learning that their suffering might finally receive acknowledgement. Somewhere, the people she had helped expose were calculating their options, weighing cooperation against defiance, trying to determine which path offered the best chance of survival. The investigation would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and for months beyond that, stretching into a future that none of them could fully predict. But for now, in the quiet darkness of an anonymous apartment, Simone Adler slept. 6 weeks later, the outcomes began crystallizing into their final forms. The federal building's conference room had become familiar territory during the intervening weeks. Simone had spent more hours here than in her apartment, reviewing evidence, preparing testimony, coordinating with prosecutors whose caseloads had expanded to accommodate the investigation's growing scope. Today's meeting would provide status updates on each of the original subjects. Catherine Marsh presided, her case files now occupying 3 full banker's boxes, rather than the single folder she had carried on the first day. Let's start with Randall. She opened the first file. Grand jury indictment returned last week. 18 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. 4 counts of assault. 2 counts of evidence tampering. Total potential sentence, 63 years federal time. Is he cooperating? No. His attorney is mounting an aggressive defense. Claims the entire investigation was entrapment. Claims Agent Adler provoked the courtroom incident deliberately. Claims the documented pattern of abuse was fabricated through selective editing of recordings. Marsh shook her head. None of it will hold up, but it's going to make the trial longer and more contentious than we'd hoped. Trial date? Tentatively scheduled for October, 8 months from now. Could be pushed back if motions continue at the current pace. 8 months. Simone absorbed this timeline without visible reaction. Justice moved slowly. She had known this from the beginning, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Cole's cooperation agreement was finalized yesterday. Marsh moved to the next file. He's pleading guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to deprive rights. Recommending sentence, 18 months, eligible for reduction based on cooperation quality. He's already provided testimony that strengthens our case against Wynn significantly. The emails he mentioned? Recovered from backup servers. 23 messages over a 2-year period. Explicit instructions to courthouse staff regarding which defendants should receive, quote, additional attention, end quote. The demographic pattern is unmistakable. Wynn was directing discriminatory treatment based on race. This was substantial progress. Documentary evidence of judicial misconduct was rare and valuable. Cole's cooperation had produced exactly what the prosecution needed to pursue charges against a sitting judge. Wynn's status? Suspended from the bench pending JQC review, his attorney is fighting the suspension, arguing it prejudices his defense in potential criminal proceedings. The Florida Supreme Court will rule on that argument next month. Marsh paused. Realistically, he's never going back to that bench. Whether he faces criminal conviction or not, his judicial career is over. And the criminal case? Under review by the Attorney General's office. They're being cautious. Judicial immunity creates complications even when the conduct clearly exceeds judicial functions. We may end up with administrative consequences only, no criminal charges. No criminal charges. After 22 years of documented abuse, after directing staff to target defendants based on race, after using contempt citations as weapons against people who dared to assert their rights. Harold Wynn might escape prosecution entirely, protected by the very immunity that was supposed to ensure judicial independence rather than shield judicial misconduct. Simone kept her expression neutral. This outcome had always been possible. The legal system contained structures that protected its own participants, even when those participants violated the principles the system claimed to uphold. Voss accepted a plea deal this morning. Marsh continued through the files. 2 years probation, permanent bar from law enforcement employment. She's cooperating with testimony against Randall and providing documentation of internal communications that suggest the pattern of abuse was known and tolerated by supervisors going back at least 5 years. 5 years of known abuse and no intervention? The complaints were filed, the investigations were conducted, the findings consistently came back as unsubstantiated. The system worked exactly as designed, which is to say, it protected the people inside it from accountability for what they did to the people outside it. The assessment was blunt but accurate. Institutional self-protection was not a failure of the system. It was a feature. The structures that allowed abuse to continue were not accidents or oversights. They were choices made repeatedly by people who understood what they were enabling and decided that enabling it served their interests. This is where justice gets complicated. Hit that like button if you want to see how it all plays out. Meeks. Marsh reached the final original subject. Here's where it gets frustrating. His union filed a grievance claiming the termination was retaliatory. Arbitration ruling came back last week. Let me guess. Reinstated, with back pay. The arbitrator found that while his conduct was inappropriate, it did not rise to the level of terminable offense under the collective bargaining agreement. He's back at work as of Monday. Devin Meeks, the clerk who had deliberately misfiled cases, who had lied about documentation requirements, who had participated in the systematic harassment of defendants whose only crime was expecting fair treatment. Reinstated. Back at his desk. Protected by the same union structures that made accountability nearly impossible. Simone thought about Marcus Jerome Wells, the defendant whose case Meeks had misfiled, the man who had been arrested at his workplace, injured during transport, held for 3 days on what turned out to be administrative error. His complaint had gone nowhere. His suffering had produced no consequences for anyone responsible. And now the person who had caused that suffering was back in position to do it again. The union protections are what they are, Marsh said, reading Simone's expression. We can't change labor law through criminal prosecution. The best we can do is document the pattern, publicize the reinstatement, and hope public pressure forces the county to address the structural issues. Hope isn't a strategy. No. But sometimes it's all we have. The meeting continued for another hour, covering ancillary subjects who had emerged during the investigation's expansion. Deputy Nathan Cross, whose missing body cam footage had raised questions, was under separate investigation by Internal Affairs. The results were expected within 60 days. Sheriff Buckley's deposition in the civil suits had been scheduled for next month, where he would face questions under oath about what he knew and when he knew it. 47 documented victims had been identified across the 3 months of Simone's surveillance. 23 had already filed civil suits against the county. 14 more were expected to join a class action being organized by advocacy groups. The remaining 10 could not be located or had declined to participate, their distrust of the legal system apparently extending even to attempts at remediation. Total settlement exposure for Jefferson County was estimated at somewhere between $8 and $15 million. The county's insurance would cover most of it, which meant taxpayers would ultimately bear the financial burden of their officials' misconduct. None of the individual perpetrators would pay anything from their own pockets. This was the mathematics of institutional accountability. Violations by individuals became liabilities for communities. The people who committed abuse faced criminal consequences, sometimes, if the evidence was overwhelming and the political will existed. But the financial costs flowed downward, dispersed across populations who had no direct involvement in the wrongdoing and no power to prevent it. After the meeting ended, Simone remained in the conference room, reviewing documents that had accumulated during the investigation's expansion phase. One file in particular had been troubling her for weeks. The correspondence recovered from Cole's plea cooperation included more than the 23 emails about targeting specific defendants. It also included a series of messages marked with unusual classification headers. Sender addresses that had been partially redacted before delivery to the prosecution team. References to contacts at the state level whose identities remained unclear. One email stood out. Dated 14 months before Simone's investigation began. Subject line, Coordination Protocol. The body text read, "Per our discussion, the Jefferson County situation is being handled consistent with established procedures. JS has been briefed and concurs with the approach. No further action required at this time. JS." The initials appeared 3 more times across the recovered correspondence, always in contexts suggesting authority, always redacted when the full name might have appeared. Someone with enough influence to approve coordination protocols, someone whose identity the system was protecting even as other participants faced exposure. Simone had requested clarification on the redactions. The response from the Attorney General's office had been carefully worded. Redactions reflect ongoing investigations that cannot be compromised by disclosure at this time. The identities in question will be revealed when appropriate prosecutorial decisions have been made. Ongoing investigations. Additional prosecutorial decisions. The language suggested that JS was a target rather than a protected witness, but it also meant that Simone would not learn who JS was until someone else decided she needed to know. She closed the file and turned her attention to another unresolved thread. Marcus Jerome Wells had been located 3 weeks after the initial arrests. He was living in Tampa now, having relocated after his experience with Jefferson County's justice system. The investigators who contacted him reported that he was willing to cooperate, but skeptical that cooperation would produce results. His skepticism was understandable. He had filed complaints through proper channels. He had trusted the system to investigate itself. He had been ignored, dismissed, labeled as a problem rather than a victim. Why should he believe that this time would be different? Simone had spoken with him directly, a phone call that lasted 47 minutes. He had described what happened during his arrest in detail that matched her suspicions about the missing body cam footage, physical force that exceeded any reasonable justification, language that suggested racial animus rather than professional conduct, and a specific moment that Wells believed had been captured on camera before the recording mysteriously stopped. Deputy Cross had said something during the arrest. Wells remembered the exact words because they had burned themselves into his memory. "You people never learn." 3 words that transformed an arrest into a civil rights violation. 3 words that would have provided clear evidence of discriminatory intent if they had been preserved. 3 words that someone had decided needed to disappear. The missing footage from Cross's body cam remained unavailable. Technical malfunction, according to official records. But the maintenance logs showed no malfunction. The chain of custody documentation showed the footage had been downloaded from the camera to the department server, and then, somehow, it had vanished. Someone had deleted it, someone with access to the server, someone who understood what the footage contained and decided that its destruction served their interests, finding that someone was proving difficult. Server access logs from 2 years ago had been overwritten during routine maintenance. The IT staff who might have performed the deletion had turned over twice since then. The trail was cold, the evidence scattered, the accountability diffused across enough people and enough time that no individual could be definitively identified as responsible. This was how systems protected themselves. Not through dramatic conspiracy, but through mundane erosion. Records disappeared, memories faded, personnel changed. The truth became harder to establish with each passing month until eventually it became impossible, lost in the gaps between what could be proven and what everyone suspected. Simone closed the Wells file and stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of seated review. The conference room's windows showed late afternoon light slanting across the city's skyline. Another day ending, another increment of progress toward outcomes that would never feel adequate. She thought about what Marsh had said during the meeting. Sometimes hope is all we have. It was not enough. Hope did not produce convictions. Hope did not restore lost wages or heal physical injuries or undo the psychological damage of being treated as less than human by the institutions that claimed to serve you. Hope was what remained when the system's limitations became undeniable, when the gap between justice promised and justice delivered stretched too wide to bridge. but it was also what kept people fighting, what drove defense attorneys to file complaints they knew would be dismissed, what motivated victims to testify despite the trauma of reliving their experiences, what convinced investigators to pursue cases that might take years to resolve and might never produce the outcomes they sought. Hope was insufficient, but its absence was worse. Simone gathered her files and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring more depositions, more document review, more incremental progress toward a justice that would arrive late and incomplete, but would still be better than no justice at all. The elevator descended through floors filled with people doing similar work on similar cases. Civil rights violations, public corruption, fraud schemes, violence. The endless catalog of human wrongdoing that required investigation, documentation, prosecution. The work never ended because the conditions that produced wrongdoing never ended. Systems created opportunities for abuse. People exploited those opportunities. Other people tried to hold them accountable. The cycle continued, generation after generation, the same patterns repeating with different names and different details, but the same essential dynamics. She stepped out of the elevator into the building's lobby, where late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows. Normal citizens passed through on normal business, unaware of the investigations happening floors above them, unaware of the evidence being cataloged, the witnesses being prepared, the cases being built that might eventually change how their communities operated. That unawareness was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the work. Most people moved through their lives trusting institutions to function properly, never encountering the abuse that others experienced daily. They read headlines about corruption scandals and shook their heads, assuming such things happened elsewhere, to other people, in other jurisdictions. They did not understand that the same dynamics existed everywhere, that every courthouse and every police department and every government agency contained the potential for abuse, held in check only by the vigilance of people willing to document and expose wrongdoing. The parking garage held her car where she had left it that morning. She drove toward her apartment through rush-hour traffic, mind still processing the day's updates. Randall awaiting trial, Cole cooperating, Wynn suspended, Voss on probation, Meeks reinstated, Buckley retired, a mixed outcome, partial accountability, some consequences for some people, others escaping through the cracks that the system's design had deliberately created. It was not the dramatic resolution that public narratives preferred, not the clean ending where villains faced comprehensive punishment and victims received complete vindication. Reality was messier than stories. Justice was slower and less satisfying than anyone wanted to admit. But it was real, it was happening, and it was more than had existed before she began her investigation. That would have to be enough. The weeks that followed brought the grinding machinery of legal process into full operation. Randall's defense team filed motions challenging every aspect of the prosecution's case. Motions to suppress evidence obtained during the undercover investigation. Motions to dismiss charges based on alleged entrapment. Motions to exclude testimony from cooperating witnesses whose credibility could be questioned. Each motion required response, argument, judicial consideration. Each one consumed time and resources that delayed the trial's eventual arrival. Cole provided his promised testimony in a series of sessions that stretched across 3 weeks. He described the informal arrangements that had governed courthouse operations for years, the unwritten rules about which defendants received additional scrutiny, the understanding that complaints would be handled internally rather than escalated to external oversight, the culture of mutual protection that made everyone complicit in everyone else's misconduct. His testimony was valuable, but also self-serving. He minimized his own role while emphasizing the involvement of others. He presented himself as someone who had gone along with existing practices rather than someone who had actively participated in creating them. The prosecutors accepted this framing because his cooperation produced evidence they needed, even as they recognized that his version of events was carefully constructed to limit his own exposure. Judge Wynn's administrative proceedings moved through their own timeline, separate from but parallel to the criminal investigation. The Judicial Qualifications Commission held hearings that were closed to the public, reviewing evidence that would eventually be summarized in official findings. The process was designed to protect judicial independence, which in practice meant protecting judges from the kind of public accountability that other officials faced. The Commission's preliminary report, released 8 weeks after Wynn's suspension, found clear and convincing evidence of judicial misconduct. Specifically, the report documented a pattern of discriminatory application of contempt citations that could not be explained by legitimate judicial discretion. The Commission recommended formal charges that could result in removal from the bench. Removal. Not criminal prosecution, not financial penalty, just the loss of a position he had already been suspended from exercising. Wynn's attorneys immediately appealed, arguing that the Commission's procedures had violated due process and that the evidence had been improperly obtained through federal investigation of matters that should have remained within state jurisdiction. The appeal would take months to resolve. During that time, Wynn would remain suspended with pay, his salary continuing while his case wound through administrative channels. Simone followed these developments through regular briefings, but her direct involvement in the Jefferson County case had diminished. New assignments demanded attention. Other jurisdictions, other patterns of abuse, other investigations that required the skills she had demonstrated in Florida. The work continued because the work always continued. One case ended and another began. One corrupt official faced consequences while others escaped accountability. The system adjusted, reformed in some areas, remained unchanged in others, and the fundamental dynamics that produced abuse persisted beneath surface changes. 3 months after the courthouse incident, Simone received a phone call that brought her back to Jefferson County for what she expected would be the last time. Renata Okafor's voice carried exhaustion that had deepened since their first meeting. The class action settlement was announced this morning, $11.3 million, distributed among 31 plaintiffs based on documented harm. That's substantial. It's money, it's not justice. The attorney paused. I've been doing this work for 5 years. I've seen settlements before. They always feel like this, like buying silence instead of achieving accountability, like the system writing a check to make problems go away rather than addressing why the problems existed in the first place. Simone understood the feeling. Financial settlements compensated victims for measurable losses but could not restore what had actually been taken from them. Dignity, trust, the belief that institutions existed to serve rather than exploit. Those losses had no dollar value, no calculation that could make victims whole. What happens to the courthouse now? New policies, mandatory training, external oversight for 18 months. The usual reform package that gets announced after scandals and forgotten within 2 years. Okafor's laugh held no humor. I've seen this cycle before. Something terrible happens. Everyone promises change. Changes get implemented. Then the attention moves elsewhere. The oversight relaxes, and the same patterns reemerge, maybe with different people, maybe in slightly different forms, but the same essential dynamics. You sound cynical. I sound experienced. There's a difference. Another pause. I called because I thought you should know about Marcus Wells. The name triggered immediate attention. The defendant whose case had been misfiled, whose arrest footage had disappeared, whose complaint had gone nowhere until federal investigation forced the system to acknowledge what had happened to him. What about him? He was part of the settlement. His share was $340,000 after legal fees, more money than he's ever had in his life. Okafor's voice softened. He called me this morning. Wanted to thank me for not giving up, for keeping his case alive when everyone else dismissed it. That's good. He also told me something else, something he hadn't mentioned before because he didn't think anyone would believe him. The attorney's tone shifted, became more careful. The night of his arrest, Deputy Cross wasn't alone. There was someone else in the vehicle, someone in plain clothes who gave instructions but never identified themselves. Someone Cross called, quote, the coordinator, end quote. Simone's pulse quickened. Did he describe this person? White male, late 50s, gray hair, expensive suit. Didn't wear a badge, but Cross treated him with obvious deference. Okafor paused. Wells said this person watched the entire arrest, watched Cross use excessive force, watched everything that happened. And then, before they transported Wells to booking, this person said something to Cross. Wells couldn't hear the exact words, but Cross's demeanor changed immediately afterward, like he'd received instructions about how to handle the situation. The coordinator, someone with authority over a county deputy, someone whose presence at an arrest suggested involvement beyond normal chain of command, someone whose identity had never appeared in any official documentation. Did Wells ever see this person again? Once. 2 weeks later, at the courthouse. The person was leaving Judge Wynn's chambers. Wells recognized him immediately but didn't say anything because he was scared. He'd already learned what happened to people who caused problems in that building. JS. The initials from the redacted emails. Per our discussion, the Jefferson County situation is being handled. JS has been briefed and concurs with the approach. Someone at the state level, someone with authority over multiple jurisdictions, someone whose identity was being protected even as subordinates faced prosecution. Renata, I need you to document everything Wells told you. Detailed statement, signed and notarized. I'll arrange federal interview as soon as possible. You think this goes higher than what you've already exposed? I think there are questions that haven't been answered, and I think someone is working very hard to make sure they stay unanswered. The call ended with promises to coordinate follow-up. Simone immediately contacted Tate, relaying the new information and requesting authorization to expand the investigation's scope. The request would require approval from Washington, given the implications of pursuing subjects at the state level, but the evidence justified expansion. JS, the coordinator, someone who had been present at Marcus Jerome Wells's arrest, someone who had given instructions that resulted in footage disappearing and complaints being dismissed, someone who remained invisible despite months of investigation. The story was not over. The accountability was not complete. Somewhere in the system's upper reaches, someone was watching the investigation unfold while remaining safely beyond its reach. This story has more layers than anyone expected. Subscribe now to make sure you see how deep this really goes. 2 weeks later, Simone returned to Jefferson County for Marcus Jerome Wells's formal interview. The session took place at the FBI field office in Jacksonville, a neutral location chosen to avoid any association with the courthouse where Wells had experienced his original trauma. He was smaller than she had expected. 5'7", slight build, the kind of person who became invisible in crowds. His eyes held the particular wariness of someone who had learned not to trust authority figures regardless of what credentials they displayed. The interview lasted 4 hours. Wells described everything he could remember about the night of his arrest: the misfiled case documents, the bench warrant, the officers who arrived at his workplace, the ride in the patrol vehicle where Deputy Cross had used language that removed any doubt about the racial motivation for his treatment, and the coordinator, the man in the expensive suit who had watched everything and said nothing until the end, when he had spoken briefly to Cross and then departed in a vehicle that Wells described as a black sedan, possibly a Lincoln, with tinted windows that prevented any view of the interior. Did you ever learn his name? Wells shook his head. Cross never said it, just called him, sir. Or the coordinator, like it was a title instead of a name. Can you describe his face in more detail? White guy, old, like maybe 60, gray hair, kind of silver really, fancy suit, dark color. He had this way of standing, like he was used to people doing what he said, like he didn't even have to raise his voice because everyone already knew they were supposed to obey. The description matched what Okafor had relayed. An authority figure, someone accustomed to command, someone whose presence at a routine arrest suggested involvement that extended far beyond Jefferson County's boundaries. After the interview, Simone reviewed the evidence with fresh perspective. The redacted emails, the references to coordination protocols, the careful protection of certain identities even as others faced exposure. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested the Jefferson County situation was not isolated, but rather connected to something larger. She requested access to databases that tracked personnel movements across Florida's judicial and law enforcement systems. Cross-referenced the description Wells had provided against records of officials who might have reason to visit Jefferson County Courthouse. Searched for connections between the county's documented patterns and similar patterns that had been reported elsewhere. The search produced nothing definitive. No name that matched all criteria. No single individual whose presence could be confirmed at the relevant times and places. Just fragments and possibilities, the kind of circumstantial evidence that suggested truth without proving it. But the absence of proof was itself suggestive. Someone with the authority Wells had described would appear in official records somewhere, unless those records had been altered. Unless the system that protected lesser officials was even more effective at protecting greater ones. JS remained a ghost. A set of initials in redacted emails. A presence felt but not confirmed. A question that the investigation could not answer with the evidence currently available. Simone filed her supplemental report and returned to her regular assignment rotation. The Jefferson County case would continue its progress through the legal system without requiring her constant attention. Randall's trial would eventually happen. Wynn's administrative proceedings would eventually conclude. The civil settlements would eventually distribute funds to victims who would eventually attempt to rebuild lives that had been disrupted by institutional abuse. And somewhere, JS would continue operating, protected by the same systems that had shielded subordinates until federal investigation forced accountability, watching, perhaps, to see whether the investigation's expansion would eventually reach high enough to threaten their position. 6 months after the courthouse incident, final outcomes began emerging from the various legal processes. Brock Randall was convicted on 14 of 18 counts after a trial that lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on the assault charges, the evidence tampering charges, and the majority of the civil rights violations. They acquitted on 4 counts where the evidence was deemed insufficient, a reminder that even overwhelming documentation did not guarantee complete conviction. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Prosecutors recommended 22 years. Defense requested time served plus supervised release, arguing that Randall's career had already been destroyed and further incarceration served no rehabilitative purpose. The judge would ultimately impose 17 years, less than requested but substantial enough to represent meaningful accountability. Judge Harold Wynn resigned from the bench 2 days before the Judicial Qualifications Commission was scheduled to vote on formal removal. His resignation letter cited health concerns and expressed hope that the Florida judicial system would learn from recent events. It did not acknowledge wrongdoing, did not apologize to victims, did not accept any personal responsibility for the patterns of abuse that had characterized his courtroom for 22 years. Criminal charges against Wynn were ultimately declined. The Attorney General's office concluded that while his conduct clearly violated ethical standards, the evidence was insufficient to prove criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt. Judicial immunity protected him from civil liability for decisions made in his official capacity. He would face no legal consequences for what he had done, only the loss of a position he had already chosen to relinquish. Devin Meeks remained employed at the courthouse. His union's successful grievance had established precedent that made termination nearly impossible absent criminal conviction. The county implemented additional oversight procedures that were supposed to prevent the kind of deliberate misfiling he had engaged in, but the procedures depended on supervisors who had themselves been complicit in the original misconduct. Marlene Voss completed her probation and relocated to another state, where her law enforcement bar presumably did not apply. Rumors suggested she had found employment in private security, her experience with courthouse operations apparently valuable to someone despite her documented history of abuse. Preston Cole served 8 months of his 18-month sentence before being released to a halfway house. His cooperation testimony had been useful, but not decisive, his credibility damaged by his obvious self-interest in minimizing his own role. He was disbarred in Florida, but had applied for admission to the bar in 2 other states, arguing that his conviction for misdemeanor conspiracy should not permanently end his legal career. The class action settlement distributed its $11.3 million across 31 plaintiffs, with individual amounts ranging from $47,000 to $612,000 depending on documented harm. Attorney fees consumed approximately one-third of the total, consistent with standard contingency arrangements, but leaving victims with less than the headlines suggested. Marcus Jerome Wells received his $340,000 and used a portion to relocate permanently, leaving Florida for a state where he believed the justice system might treat him more fairly. Whether that belief was justified remained to be seen. The patterns that had victimized him in Jefferson County existed everywhere, differing in degree but not in kind. The investigation into Deputy Nathan Cross concluded without charges. The missing body cam footage could not be recovered. The witness testimony about the coordinator could not be corroborated. The chain of evidence necessary for prosecution had too many broken links, too many gaps where documentation should have existed but did not. Cross remained employed, though he had been transferred to administrative duties pending the investigation's conclusion. His transfer was described officially as routine rotation. Unofficially, everyone understood it as the system's way of managing liability without accepting responsibility. And JS, whoever JS was, remained unidentified. The redacted emails stayed redacted. The coordination protocols stayed unexplained. The questions about how high the corruption reached stayed unanswered. Simone received commendation for her work on the case, official recognition of exceptional service in pursuit of civil rights accountability. The commendation would go in her personnel file, contributing to evaluations and advancement decisions. It represented the Bureau's assessment that she had performed well under difficult circumstances. She accepted the commendation with appropriate professional gratitude while understanding its limitations. The recognition was for what had been accomplished, not for what remained unfinished. The case file would close eventually, marked as successful prosecution of documented subjects, while the larger questions it had raised remained open indefinitely. This was the reality of institutional accountability: partial victories, incomplete justice, some consequences for some people, while others escaped through gaps the system had deliberately created. Progress that fell short of the comprehensive reform that victims deserved but exceeded the nothing they had received before. Simone had known this reality from the beginning, had accepted it as the context within which her work occurred, had made peace with the understanding that perfection was impossible, and that improvement, however inadequate, still mattered. But knowing and accepting were different from feeling satisfied. The gap between what should have happened and what actually happened remained visible every time she reviewed the case file. Every time she thought about Marcus Jerome Wells and the coordinator who had watched his abuse without consequence. Every time she remembered the emails marked JS and wondered whose protection remained intact despite everything that had been exposed. One evening, 11 months after the courthouse incident, she sat in her apartment reviewing old files when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered with professional caution. "Agent Adler?" The voice was male, older, carrying the particular authority that Wells had described. Someone accustomed to command. Someone whose words expected obedience. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching your work with considerable interest. The Jefferson County investigation was impressive, thorough, professional. The kind of accountability that the system needs more of." A pause. "But I wonder if you understand what you've actually accomplished." Simone's training kicked in, analyzing the voice for identifying characteristics while keeping the caller engaged. "Why don't you explain it to me?" "You exposed a few bad actors, removed them from positions where they could cause immediate harm. That's valuable work. But the conditions that produced those bad actors remain unchanged. The structures that enabled their behavior persist. The system absorbed your investigation, made adjustments, and continues operating essentially as before. If you believe reform is impossible, why call?" "I didn't say impossible. I said incomplete, and I'm calling because you've demonstrated abilities that might be useful for addressing more fundamental problems than a single corrupt courthouse." The voice paused. "Jefferson County was a symptom. Would you be interested in pursuing the disease?" The offer hung in the air, its implications spreading like ripples across still water. someone with knowledge of the investigation, someone with access to her contact information, someone who understood what had been accomplished and what remained unfinished, someone who might be offering partnership or might be offering something else entirely. I'd need to know who I'm talking to. A soft laugh. Of course you would. Professional caution. Appropriate given the circumstances. Another pause. I'll be in touch when you're ready to have a longer conversation about what comes next. The call ended. Simone stared at her phone, recording the number, knowing it would trace to nothing useful. JS, perhaps. Or someone connected to JS. Or someone entirely different. Someone whose agenda aligned with hers or ran counter to it in ways she could not yet determine. She set the phone down and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights spreading toward the horizon. 11 months of investigation. Months of trial preparation and testimony. Convictions and settlements and reforms that changed some things while leaving others untouched. And now this. A voice in the darkness offering answers to questions she had not been able to answer herself. Offering, possibly, the chance to pursue accountability beyond the limits of what conventional investigation could achieve. Or offering something else. A trap. A manipulation. A test whose purpose she could not discern. The city continued its nighttime rhythms, indifferent to her uncertainty. Somewhere, victims of institutional abuse were trying to rebuild lives that had been disrupted by people who faced inadequate consequences. Somewhere, perpetrators who had escaped accountability were sleeping peacefully, their positions protected by the same systems that claimed to pursue justice. And somewhere, someone was watching, someone with knowledge and authority and agenda, someone who had reached out across the distance that separated official investigation from whatever lay beyond it. Simone stood at the window until the city lights blurred into indistinct glow, thinking about choices and consequences, and the distance between the justice that existed and the justice that should exist. The investigation was complete. The case file would close. But the story, she understood now, was far from over. The phone on her desk remained silent, its screen dark, waiting for the next call that would come when the voice in the darkness decided the time was right. And somewhere in the night, a car sat parked across the street from her apartment building, its engine off, its interior dark, its occupant visible only as a silhouette watching her window with patient attention. Let them watch. She had work to do.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.